boys and young men are feeling nervous and scared to approach girls and women.
We live in a society that glorifies and promotes the hatred of men.
Told his wife that he wanted a divorce, and she responded by cutting off his genitals and putting them in the trash compactor. I think society cares a lot more about harm towards women than it does towards men.
Men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide, and nearly 12 men every day in the UK die due to suicide. 75% of suicides under 35 are male.
Phil Mitchell is a senior-accredited counselor and psychotherapist with over 20 years supporting boys and men who have experienced abuse, neglect, and trauma.
He is the author of The Sexual Abuse of Boys and Men.
Today, he joins us to discuss misandry, double standards, false allegations, and why men are often neglected in society.
When you are forcing men to fight in war, the outcome is that they are not protected. He was told that he was being a misogynist for saying that, and he was put in a detention.
Is there anything that you would say then to parents of boys? Phil Mitchell, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Let's start off with an introduction. Please could you share a little bit about yourself, your line of work, and your mission?
So yeah, my name is Phil Mitchell. As you can imagine, I get a lot of EastEnders jokes, but that's fine. It's always good for a laugh. And I'm a therapist. I've been doing that work for about 21 years. And I specialise in working with boys and men who have been abused. I work with some girls and women as well, of course, but my specialism is working with boys and men that have experienced recent and or historic abuse. It used to be mainly sexual abuse. However, in recent years, I found that work has organically led to me working with boys and men that have experienced other forms of abuse as well. So that's what a lot of what I do. I guess my mission, I've never really thought of it as a mission, but I guess my mission, is to kind of work with boys and men who have experienced various sorts of harm, disadvantage, abuse, sometimes because they are boys and men, and I am quite passionate about tackling that issue.
What do you mean by sometimes because they are boys and men?
So there are boys and men that I've worked with, I've spoken to, and boys and men that are out there where they've experienced various forms of abuse wholly because or partly because they are boys and men. So, for example, domestic abuse, for example, where a man has been hit or abused by his partner and the partner has said, oh, you should be able to deal with that because you're a man. A real man would not have a problem with that. You should be able to tolerate it. You're clearly not strong enough, etc., etc. So I think with those sorts of examples, it's pretty clear that the abuse that's been perpetrated against the man is to some degree influenced by a sort of attitude that person has towards him because he's a man.
So it's almost like in the media, it's communicated or shown that a man can't necessarily be abused. And the impression that I get is that it's sometimes almost mocked when a man is being abused. Is that something that you've kind of seen?
All the time. Not just with the clients that I've worked with, colleagues that I work with. So I also supervise qualified and trainee therapists and other practitioners, and they tell me this as well. They see it as well. There's loads of examples that come to mind. A few years ago, there was in America, there was The View, I believe it's called, where you have a number of well-known women who talk about various issues. Sharon Osbourne, for example, she spoke about a man who, I believe, if my memory serves me right, he had told his wife that he wanted a divorce, and she responded by cutting off his genitals and putting them in the trash compactor. And when this was brought up on The View by Sharon Osbourne, her response to it rather, was she thought it was quite fabulous, I believe. And the audience laughed and cheered. And I think my immediate gut response was, there's absolutely no way we would see that if it was the other way around. You know, a group of men on a daytime show talking about how perhaps a man had hacked off his wife's genitals or breasts or whatever because she asked for divorce. There would be outrage, and this was laughter, and everyone in the audience found it funny. I mean, that's just one example. There's many, many more, but we see it all the time in TV shows, in movies. You know, we see it's quite common for female characters to hit, to beat up, to kick, to abuse their male partners. You know, even if you go back to the sort of early 1900s, you would have black and white comedy shows, things like Laurel and Hardy, and you would see Oliver Hardy's wife hit him on the head with a plate, or kick him, or hit him, or punch him, and it was all played for laughs. It would be unthinkable to do it the other way around. And it kind of contributes towards this narrative that it's okay to laugh at men being hit, abused, and so on. And I think that in turn contributes towards many male victims not disclosing and not reporting.
That's awful. So you're basically saying that society has effectively normalised abuse towards men and almost made it acceptable. Is that?
I guess you could say that. Yeah, that certainly could be said from what, the examples I've just given and many, many more. I think a reasonable interpretation of that could be that, it looks like abuse towards men has been normalised. I think when we talk about male victims of domestic abuse, physical violence, sexual abuse, all sorts of different types of abuse, I think what I see in the media, from government, from celebrities, is a very clear message that women are protected, men are neglected. And perhaps that might be an oversimplification. It might be more accurate to say that the government certainly aims or tries to protect women, and I think that's fine. We should be doing that, of course we should. And at the same time, a question that it leaves me wondering is, why don't we put similar or at least more effort into helping boys and men? Look at the data, for example. Look at the Office of National Statistics. Every single year, we know that when we talk about physical violence, statistically speaking, from the ONS, men make up more victims. Most victims of homicide, most victims of violence on the street. And the narrative that you often hear from people is, yes, but who's killing them? It's other men doing it. My response is, so? They're still being killed. And I think any narrative that would suggest, well, if a victim is the same sort of demographic as the person who's killed them or hurt them or harmed them, well, we don't care. I mean, that can't be something to be proud of, and it's just certainly not helpful.
Why do you think there is this contrast between how society is viewing women and men when it comes to these kinds of issues?
In simple terms, I think society cares a lot more about harm towards women than it does towards men, a lot more. Some could say, yes, that's right. Some put it down to some degree evolution, biology. But there have been various studies, and I think one came out, was it last year or the year before, where various scenarios were presented to lots of different people. Simply put, and again, it's much more nuanced than I'm about to explain it, but simply put, the findings found that most people were really concerned when a woman is facing some sort of harm or disadvantage, but when a man faced the same or similar harm or disadvantage, they cared a lot less. And so it kind of comes from that, we really care a lot more about women than we do about men. And I'm not saying that everything should be perfectly 50-50, because I think that might be a bit naive and impossible. I'm not sure anything or everything should be perfectly 50-50. but I certainly don't think it should be so imbalanced as it is, and I generally think it is.
I see. On your blog post, I've been reading your content on your website and social media. One of the phrases that really stuck out to me was that we live in a society that glorifies and promotes the hatred of men.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on that?
Yes. Well, it's so. I mean, I could sit here all day and talk about that. So first of all, let's start with the definition. Misandry, generally speaking, is the hatred, contempt, and/or prejudice towards men because they are men. And all you have to do is quickly go online and have a look. So, for example, on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days, there are more accounts dedicated to hating men than hating women. There are more accounts dedicated to misandry than misogyny. There are more accounts, certainly last time I checked anyway, there are more accounts dedicated to people saying they are a proud misandrist than they are a proud misogynist. We hear various comments from celebrities that blatantly show hatred of men. We see every week, sometimes every day, media headlines that say or imply men are the problem, and so on and so on. Education is a great example. So at the minute we are, this country, we're teaching boys anti-misogyny lessons. That came out this week. And whilst I absolutely think that, the attitude of misogyny should be tackled, it shouldn't be done whilst we completely ignore misandry. There was a case in Australia about, I think it was 3 years ago, where a school in Victoria, a school or a college in Victoria, I believe it was, they got all boys from a certain year group, lined them up or in front of the girls or made them turn to the girls and basically say, sorry that our gender rapes you. Sorry, it encouraged that collective guilt. And so that's just one example. There's many, many more. There are headlines printed where some journalists and people in the public eye will go, yes, we do hate men. We should be allowed to hate men. Look what men have done to us. But what that's doing, it's taking what a fraction of a percentage of men on the planet do and using that to generalise all men, which, again, I think there would be outrage, much more loud condemnation if we applied that thinking to any other demographic. And so there's lots out there. I've had people message me telling me, yes, they are a misandrist. They're proud of their misandry. They want to be a misandrist. It's great to hate boys and men. And again, it's painting boys and men as if they are this demographic that are evil, abusive and horrible and terrible. And again, it's just prejudice, it's misandry, and it's just not helpful.
What do you think that does to the mindset or the health of a boy and a man? Obviously, you work in mental health and you see thousands of patients over the course of your career. What impact is all this messaging doing?
Well, I think it makes boys and men feel completely isolated, completely alienated, and utterly neglected. And I think that the problem, though, is that we as society, media, the government, police, we don't care. We just don't care and don't even consider the impact that has. Where the kind of idea that people could hate women, and the thought that goes into exploring how that hate might influence some sort of harm, abuse or disadvantage towards women. We talk about it all the time. We see headlines all the time. There's research going into that, and rightly so. I have no problem with that. And at the same time, the idea that people hate boys and men, but the fact that we put very little thought into how such hate may influence harm, abuse and neglect and adversity towards boys and men, it's an absolute crying shame. And I've worked with plenty of boys and men and spoken to many more, and colleagues who I work with and supervise have also spoken to boys and men. And what we're anecdotally hearing is it makes them feel pretty rubbish. And it's pretty obvious, isn't it? If you go around and you pick up a newspaper, you go online, you have a look at things, you see what people are saying in your school, you see what your employers are saying, you see what the police are saying, you see what the government are saying, you are left feeling, wow, this country hates me because I'm a man. And that makes me feel pretty rubbish. Of course, it's going to make you feel rubbish. You don't need, you don't need loads of research to kind of know that. But I think it might be useful to explore. But how, let's go a bit deeper. But we don't, because I think generally speaking, as I said earlier on, society cares a lot less about how hate may influence some sort of harm and abuse and neglect towards boys and men.
So how does that manifest then? So if a child comes into your clinic, what kind of issues do they present to you or need to be working through after being exposed to this type of messaging?
So bullying is one. So I've spoken with boys and men where they've been bullied in the workplace or at school, and there have been elements of misandry within that. And it's been pretty clear. Some of them, not all of them to be fair, but when some of them have kind of explained this and tried to speak to, head teachers, for example, and managers, a lot of the time it's laughed, it's dismissed, it's mocked, it's minimised. There was a boy, I should also say as well that I've got permission to share this, but there was a boy that contacted me a while ago now, and he was talking about how in school there'd been a discussion about history and gender and things like that. And the according to what he said to me, there was a teacher who had said to him that women didn't have the vote and all men did have the vote. And he said, oh, that's not true, is it? Actually, a lot of men also didn't have the vote as well. And it was, that's not really true. It's, it's like, and he gave a bit more of an accurate picture. He was told that he was being a misogynist for saying that, and he was put in a detention. And he was silenced, and he was thinking, hang on, but I feel like I should speak up, but now I'm nervous about speaking up. And lots of people in the class criticised him. They said, yes, you are a misogynist, but there's nothing there, certainly from what he told me, that evidences any misogyny. He was basically saying, let's have some accuracy. Let's not paint this portrayal that when it comes to the vote, men had everything and women had nothing. Let's just have a little bit more accuracy. And so there's examples like that. And, I sometimes have men and boys that will contact me and they are nervous, they're scared, they're anxious, they're fed up. There was I think it was it Channel 4 or Channel 5? I can't remember. It was last year. Danny Dyer did a documentary where he talked to sort of boys and men about masculinity and being a man and all of that sort of stuff. And there was a group of sort of teenage boys in a school that he spoke to. And he was asking their views and things like that. And to cut a long story short, and I can't remember the exact terminology, the boys were basically saying, we're sick of being judged because of what abusive, violent men do. I think there was one particular boy where he said, you take this man, he's done something horrible, and we say that's what all boys and men are like. And they were fed up of it, and they were sick of it, and they didn't like it. And so I often say, maybe we should be asking more boys and men in school and colleges what they think and how they feel. But we don't. We're not doing that at all. And again, it's just another example of how we're neglecting boys and men.
It's almost like, I think, that logical fallacy of collective blame, which is like judging an entire demographic of people for the actions of the few. And it seems to me like it's becoming quite pervasive in the media, particularly against men. So going back to what you talked about with the intervention in school in terms of what happened this week, which is misogyny lessons?
I think some of the headlines I've seen said something along the lines of schools are now starting to deliver anti-misogyny lessons to boys, something like that.
What are your thoughts on that?
Not great. I should say that, the attitude of misogyny, the idea that anyone could think, I hate women because they're women and I will control them, harm them, abuse them, of course that needs addressing. I'm certainly not saying it shouldn't. I think, the guidance that came out earlier this year, I believe it was, from the government, the Department for Education, about relationship and sex education and things like that, it made it pretty clear that said, don't dehumanize boys, don't demonize them, don't kind of say anything that makes it sound that you're inherently a problem. And I think, there's narratives out there that are saying, yeah, well, we're not doing that. I disagree. I think any school that says we are going to basically teach our boys to respect girls, but we're going to do nothing to teach girls to respect boys, that's not promoting fairness or equality. That's a very rigidly gender-biased narrative. And there are boys out there that are saying, but why are you just targeting the boys and not the girls? Why is that okay? Kill all men was a hashtag that was trending, I think it was about 3 years ago, something like that. And as I said earlier, there's certainly more accounts on Twitter dedicated to kill all men than there are kill all women. And if we think, well, that is an attitude that's being expressed online, how might that attitude influence other things that are going on away from the online spheres? And again, we don't address it. And boys are asking, why are we being targeted? We're being treated as if we are this inherent problem. There was an organisation who did some research, I suppose you would call it, a year or so ago, and they spoke to a number of schools or asked a number of schools for information about what they were teaching boys around the phrase toxic masculinity. And I think it was 197 schools responded. And I think something like 1 in 3 were saying, yes, we do teach on it. And of those that said they do teach on it, I can't remember the exact figures, but a number had said that they were teaching their children that there is something inherently problematic with being a young man, and that there are elements of masculinity that are sort of inherently a problem. And again, it's like, but how on earth can that be an okay message? How is that going to make boys and men feel? And again, we don't, and I'm not saying we should, but we don't do the same with girls and women and femininity. And if we talk about elements of masculinity being a problem, which I don't think is helpful at all, and I think the wording needs a lot more thought around it, well, then what we're doing is we're only saying when these behaviours that allegedly come under the heading of masculinity, they're a problem when boys display them, but not when girls display them. And so the whole thing is absolutely biased, it's problematic, and there's emerging research that shows that the phrase toxic masculinity is harmful, it's problematic, it's alienating. John Barry, Martin Seeger, and his colleagues, they've done research in the phrase toxic masculinity. I think a few years ago, there was a survey done, and I think it was 85% of people who took part in the survey had said they thought the term was insulting and probably harmful to boys. Since then, there's been other research by John and his colleagues, where I think just over 4,000 men in the UK and Germany, they took part in some research. The vast majority of them, I can't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but the vast majority of them had said that, or they believed thinking that masculinity is bad, it kind of contributes to poor mental health in boys and men. But interestingly, it also showed that if you think masculinity is good and can be helpful and positive, that contributes to good mental health, which makes sense, doesn't it?
ATHANASE, which is a herbal blend specially formulated for men. It contains herbs like maca root, reganda, guarana, fenugreek, ginger, and more, all designed to increase your daily output inside and outside of the gym. What do people mean when they say toxic masculinity? Because when I hear that term, I don't know why exactly, but to me, it's very triggering. It makes me feel like I'm a problem. And I think people might resonate with that. It just, what are people trying to say when they say that?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. So a common response in my experience is we don't mean that masculinity is toxic. We just mean it can be toxic. That's a common response. And okay, let's explore that. But again, rather than talking about toxic masculinity, why don't we talk about sort of behaviour that can be toxic? Why is it just masculinity? And I think that's the thing. You pick 10 people off the street and say to them, I'm going to say a word to you, and I want you to tell me which word think automatically comes after it to you. Go up to them and say, toxic. Guarantee you, most of them will go masculinity. Why do they think that? Because it is everywhere. It is written in the media. It's all over the place. We don't talk nowhere near as much about toxic femininity. And I certainly don't think we should. I don't think toxic femininity or toxic masculinity are helpful terms. As I said, there's emerging research that is showing that, boys and men don't like it. It puts them off. Some are, and I've had people that have explicitly told me masculinity is bad, it is harmful, there are elements of it that are bad and abusive. And again, it is what you might call the essence of being a boy or a man. And it makes people think there's something wrong with me because you are putting that word toxic before masculinity so often that I can't help but think you're saying there's something wrong with being a boy or a man. And if we're saying, well, no, that's not really what we mean, well, change your language. It's not drawing boys towards you, it's making them move away. And if we're talking about behaviours that boys and men display that could have an harmful impact, let's explore that, but we can do it without using the phrase toxic masculinity. Same with girls and women. Let's also do the same with that. Let's encourage respect and care and decent behaviour without doing it in a way that promotes this really rigid, gendered narrative that's just not helpful.
So why do you think there's this intervention in the first place, behind addressing these issues that society is perceiving to be taking place in men and this kind of role between men and women? Like, I know when it came to these misogyny lessons in school, I think that was off the back of that TV show, Adolescence, and also male influencers like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. What's going on here?
Well, first of all, in my opinion, I don't think we can reasonably lump Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate together. Yes, there may be similarities, but there are arguably a lot more differences. I think, Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, they regardless of what your views or opinion are, I'm not sure we can say they are of the same ilk, for want of a better phrase. But ultimately, it's that narrative that we must look after and protect girls and women and do whatever we can at all costs. And so when Andrew Tate kind of gets all the attention, he makes certainly some very inappropriate comments. But again, what we're doing there is we're looking at Andrew Tate, we're shining this intense torch on him, but completely leaving other loud voices online in the dark. So there are a number of people that will make very regular anti-male comments, promoting blatant misandry online, and that just is left in the dark while we're honing in on Andrew Tate. And there are some people that will take a step back and go, well, of the boys that do go towards Andrew Tate, they are asking, why do they go towards him? Let's think about what that's about and what's going on there. But if you look at, there was a YouGov survey, was it last year or the year before? Can't remember. But it was saying that most young people have a very negative view of Andrew Tate. And of the ones, if I'm quoting it correctly, of the ones that do have some sort of positive view on him, they're more interested in his views on success and masculinity than they are on his views of women. And so again, and I think that the term that often comes up is, these boys and men engaging with this content. What does that mean, engaging? If I'm seeing Andrew Tate being mentioned in the news all the time, well, I'm going to be like, oh gosh, this guy's everywhere. I now know it. I'm interested. What do I know? I'm interested in this. I might go on YouTube, have a look, and I watch his video. So you could say that I've engaged with that content. Does it mean I agree with his views? Not necessarily. Does it mean I support him? No, not at all. And so there's this assumption almost that because a number of boys and young men are watching his videos, they agree with him and things like that. Whereas if you speak to the vast majority of boys and men, most of them don't. But the idea that, a growing number, allegedly, of boys and young men maybe watching his videos, that's viewed as a problem. Whereas we're not even talking about girls and women who might be engaging with or watching or endorsing or agreeing with anti-male content. And again, that's that bias that we see.
I never really see any, I guess, like the equivalent to Andrew Tate for women.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see that much content out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there like anti-male kind of influences, would you say?
I mean, I'm not sure if they would be classed as anti-male influences. Some might say there are, but there are certainly individuals, sort of well-known celebrities, various academics perhaps, and other people in the public eye who have made various hateful anti-male comments. For example, this week, Cardi B, for example, she was in, it wasn't widely covered, but she had basically said how a male paparazzi photographer had asked her an allegedly inappropriate question around paternity or a relationship that she was in. And she said that was really inappropriate. And according to the media, she threw a marker at him, a marker pen. And the way that this was kind of portrayed in the media was good on her, great stuff, and so on. There's absolutely no way that would have happened if it was the way around at all. If you had a female photographer that said to a male celebrity some sort of inappropriate question, if he threw a marker pen at her, it'd be more widely out there. And so I guess the point is that even if you do struggle to find the equivalent, should we say, of Andrew Tate, you could say it doesn't really matter, because actually the misandry is so common and out there, held by so many people. I'm not saying at all that girls and women have got it easy, and I'm not saying that misogyny doesn't exist. I know some people do think that. What I'm saying is, yes, tackle the attitude of misogyny, but don't completely ignore the attitude of misandry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to take us back to, I want to share some statistics, effectively, of what I came across.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to try and understand like what's going on here. So I think like it's quite negative, but it's something like only 24% of men with mental health struggles would talk to friends. Less than 50% of those would actually seek medical help.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to suicide, male suicide rate is something like 17.4 suicides per 100,000 people, compared to 5.7 for women, which is growing because it's now the highest since 1999. The other fact is, or claim is, men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide, and nearly 12 men every day in the UK die due to suicide.
Mm-hmm.
75% of suicides under 35 are male.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes, there's a lot more statistics here that I can read off, but when it comes to this issue with misandry and misogyny, what role do you think they play in these stats, if any?
Well, I think for me, a lot of that comes down to the messages that we're giving men, to boys and men. And often, in my experience, the message is, men, you've got problems, men, you're to blame for your problems, and you are not engaging in the help that's out there, so you're also to blame for that. Again, completely, I would argue, inaccurate and completely unhelpful. I think there are elements of misandry there where I think we're blaming men to some degree because they are men. And what we are often seeing is that, well, men don't want to be vulnerable, or should I say, what we're often hearing is comments from various individuals and various sectors saying men don't want to be vulnerable. So because they don't want to be vulnerable, that's their toxic masculinity. And so masculinity in that sense is bad. It's stopping men from engaging in support, and then that's contributing towards their loneliness, their poor mental health, suicide, etc. And it goes back to, well, then men are to blame. I think that the point here is that there are average sex differences between males and females. Keyword there is average. Nothing is absolute, average. And if we change our approach to make it more attractive to and accessible to men, we may find that more boys and men come to us for support. For example, years ago, my website, my practice, it was all very traditionally therapeutic, you might say. It would say things such as come to therapy, talk about your problems, express your emotions, that sort of thing. And again, nothing wrong with that. I found quite quickly, I would say, that a lot of boys and men, most of them that I work with, didn't like that. They didn't want that, or they didn't want just that. And so I read some psychological literature, and one of the books I read, a very big, bulky book, but I absolutely recommend it, was the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health. And once I read this book, it validated everything that I had been doing. And what I had been doing was changing my approach to make it more action-orientated, to make it more, what a term I would now use, which is male-centric, shall we say. And so the narrative that would say, well, men just need to engage with vulnerability, they need to accept that they're vulnerable and things like that, I was finding, well, actually, if we use elements of masculinity within our work, we might find that we engage more boys and men. So I changed my website, and through feeling validated after reading the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health, I found that some of the things I were doing, like using action-orientated language and different words and things like that, this book validated it. I thought, yes, this is okay. This is right. It's working. So I changed a lot of my website. I changed a lot of the wording. So instead of saying, come to therapy, express your emotions, talk about your problems, that sort of thing, I used words such as take action, take control of your life, tackle your problems, that sort of stuff. I saw a significant increase in boys and men coming to me for therapy. Significant. And using that sort of language, what I was kind of doing was finding that this language was more attractive to boys, it was more accessible to them. And some would say, well, isn't that really bad? Because you need to be encouraging boys and men to embrace their vulnerability. My question to that is, why? As a therapist, my job is to work with whoever I'm working with and get them to their final session where they leave saying, I got something useful out of my time with you. And I found that was being achieved through using elements of masculinity in a positive, healthy way. Mm-hmm. And if it didn't work, I'd stop doing it. But it is working. And it works all the time. And so I would use what Martin Seeger, who's a chartered psychologist, he has done some work with John Barry around masculinity and things like that. He talks about the archetypes of masculinity, which are fighting and winning, providing and protecting, and self-mastery and control over your emotions. And I think those archetypes are often viewed and labelled as some as, well, they're bad. Control is bad. Fighting is bad. Well, hang on a minute. What about considering when fighting can be useful and when it's needed and when it's protective and it strives you on? What about thinking when control can be useful and healthy and help you achieve something? So it's having that balance a little bit more. Mm. And so rather than saying to boys and men, it's okay to be vulnerable, you can sit here with your vulnerability. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. If that approach works, fine. But if it doesn't work, and I found that with a lot of boys and men it wasn't working, you can change your language to say, I guess coming here is difficult for you. And whilst it's difficult, you're still here. You could have cancelled, but you're sitting there. It's clearly difficult. And even though you're still there and you're going through something difficult, I guess that's perhaps you starting to tackle your problems, starting to take control, even though you find it difficult. And that sounds like strength to me. What do you think? And sometimes they'll go, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that. And when you see those comments or you hear those comments, it's like, yes, this approach clearly is going to be right for you because it gets you to think differently. And again, you're using archetypal elements of masculinity, to engage them, to get them to engage in that process.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I actually went to therapy voluntarily 3.5 years ago, but I dropped out after, I think I tried it for 3 months every week just to see as an experiment. And I think what you're saying here resonates a lot with what my experience was. I didn't feel like I was getting much use out of it after each session. I felt good. Like I feel, almost like some weight had been lifted off of me. But then I went home and realized, hold on, nothing's really changed in the problems that I'm having that I want to solve. And I think like men, do you think men have a general apprehension towards therapy in general in the first place? Because I certainly did. I was recommended therapy a long time ago by my peers. And it was only like a decade later that I thought, let me give it a go. Let's see what it's about. Do you feel that's the case?
In many cases, yes. So when boys and men come to me, a lot of them have been recommended by others because of the approach I use, that I don't demonize masculinity. I don't say it's bad or horrible or toxic or inherently bad. I say masculinity is masculinity, and actually the how you express it, well, the impact of that could be harmful, the impact of it could be helpful, and I would argue in the vast majority of cases it's pretty helpful. But I found that by utilising elements of masculinity, by changing your language to make it more action-orientated, I found so many boys and men engaging that way of working. And if they didn't, again, as I've said, I would stop using it. But absolutely. So, what you've just said is I've worked with boys and men that have said exactly the same as you. Oh, I saw this other therapist and they were really lovely and really nice and it was good to offload, but I wanted more than that. Or that wasn't enough. I wanted to feel that, progress was being made and it wasn't. There was a study done in Australia. I can't remember how many years ago now, but it explored sort of men engaging in therapy. And I can't remember again the exact percentages, but quite a high percentage of men dropped out because they felt it lacked progress. And I think that's, boys and men on average, and again, we're talking about averages here, they wanted to see some sort of progress. And for them, going to a session and offloading was good, but it wasn't enough. They wanted progress. They wanted to see something else. And when I work with clients, I often say there's 3 vague types of change that we could be talking about. So by the end of our time together, hopefully you will either feel differently, think differently, and or be doing something differently. And I find that saying that can really prompt an interesting discussion, and you get to an idea of, well, what is it you want to get out of this? And some people don't know. They don't know what they want the outcome to be, but through a discussion, you might kind of figure it out together. But I think there's more therapists, more practitioners in the mental health field, if they utilise elements of archetypal masculinity within their practice, I honestly think that they may see an increase in more boys and men engaging with them, working with them and getting an outcome. I've certainly seen that in my practice to a really significantly noticeable degree.
I see. I want to move on to, so essentially over the last couple of years, we've seen more data come out around the dynamics between men and women and forming relationships. One stat that I came across was how 45% of young men have never approached a woman before. And I want to try to understand why, because one thing I want to talk about as well is the Home Office data suggests around 3% of rape allegations are proven false, which equates to around 40 men per week in the UK. And so going back to men approaching women for romantic interest, one thing that stood out to me was that men are kind of afraid, or they're just afraid of taking risks.
Yeah.
What do you think is going on there?
Well, first of all, I think the 40 a week, you might have got that from me because that's something I put out there. However, I should probably clarify and be more accurate with that. So it was recently pointed out to me that 40 allegations a week doesn't necessarily mean 40 men. And that is correct, because some of these false allegations will be made where an individual is not identified. Okay. I think the issue is that, yes, if you look at the report that says 3% were, I think, likely false was the wording they used.
Okay.
If we say that 3%, yes, and you apply that 3% to the number of reported rapes to the police in the year ending September 2024, it does equate roughly to about 40 false allegations a week. I think for me, the question is, how many of those false allegations were made against an identifiable individual man? The answer, I guess, is we don't know. Why don't we know? Because we care a lot less about tackling false allegations of abuse than we do when it comes to tackling abuse, and that's a real problem. There was what comes to mind as I listened to you speak was a 2023 sort of news piece on. There was some panel discussion, I can't remember, on some TV show, and it said more or less what you said about boys and young men are feeling nervous and scared to approach girls and women for I think the phrasing was clumsy mistakes. So, for example, you might have a teenage boy and he's with a teenage girl and he thinks that, she's into me, I'm into her, this sounds, I'm getting a good vibe here. He goes to kiss her and she moves away going, no, I'm not interested. What are you doing? And he's going, oh, sorry, I just thought. And then she will report him. She'll spread rumours about him. Again, I'm not saying this is a generalisation for all girls, but it does make some boys and men feel very cautious. And when this was discussed in the news a couple of years ago, I remember a number of panellists on this particular show I was watching had said, I like that. I like the fact that boys and men are nervous and scared. That's what we want. I've gone, is it? Is that what you want? And I think that's just, we certainly don't want to be at one extreme of the end of the scale, but we don't want to be at the other either. And when it comes to false allegations, I've worked with, and I never expected at all to do this, but when I was working with I started doing my job full time, a number of the boys and men that I were working with who had never worked with, who had been sexually abused as children or adults or had experienced domestic violence, etc., a number of them were threatened with false allegations. A number of them had been falsely accused. Some of them were known to the police, and the police had said, yes, we know this is false, but we can't pursue it. Others, it never went to the police, but their reputation was damaged. The point I'm making is that false allegations can have utterly devastating effects. And that's because boys and men, on average, want to be nice, decent guys. And that completely can destroy their lives. And I really don't think we do anywhere near enough to focus on the damage that false allegations can do. We have specific offences for sexual offences, as we should. Every quarter, the Office of National Statistics puts out data about how many sexual offences have been reported to the police. We don't hear anything similar about how many false allegations have been reported. The law, for example, so false allegations in this country, if I'm getting this correct, it comes under perjury, wasting police time, and perverting the course of justice. Well, if you think about those three sorts of offences, and I'm not sure if they're all offences, but if you think about those three elements, it's all about the police and the justice system. The justice system is affected. We've had the police, their time has been wasted. You've affected the course of justice. And that matters. But where are the victims in that? Where are the actual victims of false allegations within that? They're not there at all. And again, if we think about the report you mentioned, which shows 3% are likely / probably false, that report, I believe, relates just to rape. Well, let's think about other types of offences, other types of crimes, other types of abuse that can also be false. And again, I'm certainly not saying that we should, ignore and minimise rape, domestic abuse and things. Of course we shouldn't. And generally we don't. Every week there's headlines out there that tackle it, condemn it and so on. And that's absolutely right to do so. And at the same time, whilst we're doing that, it doesn't mean we should completely minimise the prevalence and effects of false allegations.
So is there any... So obviously you've spoken about how society in some ways views men and women differently. When men, I mean, I think I recall seeing something about how men and women are treated differently in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Can you speak on that?
I think there's probably other people that can speak on that more effectively, perhaps with more credibility than I can. But from my knowledge, yes, absolutely. Google Scholar shows you all the research that's out there. Generally speaking, if you have a man who has committed a crime, on average, he's statistically more likely to receive a longer and harsher sentence than a woman who has committed the same or similar crimes. And there's a number of studies that have shown this. I think a 2015, I think it was, a 2015 report said something about how male offenders, I think, are 63% more likely than a female offender to get a longer and or harsher sentence under similar circumstances. And again, and if we look at what we've seen this year, we've seen in the media how girls and young women are not going to be put into secure centres. Boys and women still will be. We've talked about, or we've seen in the news about how, questioning, are prisons the right place for women? We haven't asked that for men. And so again, there's a real bias there, and ultimately, a quick Google search of various headlines, we have a lot more, we sympathise with female perpetrators. We criminalise and pathologise male perpetrators more. Again, I'm not saying it's absolute, but on average, and that's what we see. And when you have these discussions with people, often what emerges is, yes, but the women that have committed these crimes, they've had a terrible upbringing, they've had terrible abuse in their background and so on, and all very valid, and that may have contributed towards, to some degree, what they did. But to suggest or imply that male offenders did not have any of that is completely false. I think it was who did some research, I believe, and again, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but she did some research about men in prison. A lot of them had experienced abuse when they were younger as well. And so we can't really be saying that, well, we need to have sympathy for these female perpetrators because they were abused when they were younger, but we don't have any sympathy for the male perpetrators when they were also abused when they were younger. Again, it's like, hang on, what's that all about? And that's another one of the biases that we often see that I mentioned earlier.
So what role does the father play in all of this? Because you keep hearing nowadays about how boys are growing up in fatherless homes, and that's one factor in, this misogyny and why, this mental health crisis. Is there any kind of link there?
I think it's really interesting. I think about my dad, and my dad's 80 now, and I remember being younger, and I remember him. We used to play very much sort of rough and tumble, and he would sort of pick me up and throw me over his shoulder, and I remember that there's one time we'd go somewhere, and he would kind of make out he was going to throw me into the river, which at the time I think I remember being a little bit scared, but I also remember laughing about it at the same time. And now I'm older, I do laugh about it. I wasn't traumatized. He wasn't actually going to throw me into a river, of course, but there was something I look back and I think that built my resilience. And I'm certainly not saying mums don't do that, shouldn't do that, or can't do that. I generally think from my own experience, my professional experience, you see that sort of resilience building that is provided on average by the dads. And there are average differences between, what mums do and what dads do. I'm not saying that's how it absolutely should be. I'm saying that generally speaking, that's how you find it. There are differences. And so what we know is a lot of children grow up without a dad, and then they go to school, and a lot of the teachers are women. Again, all fine, but I think there's that, hang on, what about experiencing elements of masculinity in a really healthy, positive way? And it kind of leads sometimes into that narrative that, well, we don't need dads. I've seen, you might have seen, I'm not sure, but I've certainly seen countless of comments in various forums, chat rooms, blog posts, oh, we don't need dads, women can do it all on their own and that's fine. But actually, let's think about what some of these children need, and let's maybe think about the differences between what a dad can give and what a mum can give. And I don't think it should be done in a competition, in a way that gives a competitive element. It's about linking them together. It's about complementing each other, and I think we need more of that. And it's that balance of perhaps what you might call a sort of nurturing feminine influence and a nurturing masculine influence together, and kind of appreciating the similarities, but also appreciating some of the differences and how they can help grow our children.
Is there anything that you would say then to parents of boys in terms of advice and kind of actions to take?
Do not treat them as if they are an inherent problem. Don't treat them as defective girls. Don't treat them as if they are on the edge of doing something horrifically violent and abusive. Don't assume because they like what you might call a bit of rough and tumble that that's a problem. Don't kind of treat them in this way that says you are some inherent problem of the world. I think sometimes it's about understanding the differences. And so I'm a big fan of nature and nurture. Years ago, I'm a little bit ashamed to say it, but years ago I thought all of the differences between males and females were 100% purely to do with society and upbringing. I read, since then I've spoken to loads of psychologists, neuroscientists. I've read a huge amount of data and research and literature around this, and I was wrong. And it's not just society and upbringing, it's nature and nurture. And there's loads of research out there, a lot of it with consistent findings that say there are average sex differences between the brains of males and females, and that has an influence in the decisions that we make and the behaviours we display. There are a lot more similarities than differences, but the differences are there, and they're significant, and they do matter. And so it's about kind of acknowledging both rather than kind of completely ignoring one and focusing on just the other.
What kind of differences have you noticed then in terms of the genders when it comes to nature?
So I guess from the boys and men I have worked with, spoken to, it comes back to what I said earlier on, I guess, that on average, and again, it is average differences, not absolutes. On average, I see boys and men wanting a more action-orientated approach. It's what I said earlier on, they prefer, generally speaking, a more action-orientated way of working. So rather than just talking and expressing your emotions, I generally find that they find it useful to explore, practical things. So rather than saying to a man, as I said, it's okay to be vulnerable, and I can really get a sense that there's some real strong sadness behind that. It may be that I could say that, but I'll follow it with some sort of action-orientated comment. An example that comes to mind actually was years ago when I was living in the Midlands. There was, I remember working with a guy, and he said something to me, and I was kind of fresh out of university, and I was doing the whole traditional therapy thing, and I was, the whole, sitting there nodding, yeah, I hear what you're saying, that sort of thing. And I remember replying something along the lines of, I can really hear that, you're here, and there's this here, and I can hear you really want to, I'd put the soft voice on and all that, and I can really hear you want to try and do this, and it feels like there's a real barrier between there and here, and I'm kind of wondering what that barrier might be. And he turned round to me very bluntly and said, Phil, why don't you just ask me why? And I remember going, oh, no, my training, don't ask why. That's really bad. It's terrible. Why is not the question that you ask. And then I thought about it, and I realised, and it's so obvious when you say it out loud, one size does not fit all. And there are differences on average between what a male may want from therapy and what a female may want from therapy. And there's nothing wrong with that if it's ethical and it gets you to a point when they get something useful out of it.
Absolutely. Are there any recommendations you have for young men in general? We spoke about parents, but for men and boys themselves?
I think it's a tricky one. There's recommendations. I would say, make some good networks. Don't don't think that just because you might see headlines and lots of narratives out there that say or imply masculinity is bad and toxic and that being a boy or a man is bad and toxic, don't feed into that. Don't agree. You don't have to agree with that. Quantity does not always evidence quality. And, if you've got a view that may suggest that you think something different to what we might call the prevailing narrative, that's okay. Now, you might not always feel comfortable saying that for various reasons, but it's okay to have that view, and entering into respectful discussion, maybe even respectful debate can be okay, but sometimes you have to pick your battles. But in very simple terms, I think what I would also, maybe not advice, but what I would say is very clearly, there is nothing wrong with you because you're male. There is nothing wrong with you. Not recently, but a few years ago, colleagues and I think there's something else in the news at the time, colleagues and I were getting messages from boys and young men in school, college, university, long story short, saying, am I bad because I'm a boy? Am I bad because I'm a guy? Does being a male mean I'm going to definitely become a rapist? And so on and so on and so on. And it was really interesting because I thought for a few days I was the only one receiving these messages, and I wasn't at all. There were other colleagues that were seeing and hearing the same thing. And so we have to just put that message out there that goes, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with being male. There's nothing wrong with being a boy, being a man, nothing at all. And the question is, why are these boys and men even asking this question? And it comes back to what we said right at the start, which is, well, look at what they're seeing. Look at the messages that they are being given. Is it any wonder that some of them are thinking this? And I think our job can be go, no, actually, let's have a discussion about that, and let's kind of give you some reassurance.
Yeah, I like that. I want to read off another part of your blog post that I found very interesting, because I think this highlights a double standard, as you called it. So it's quite a long one, but I'll read it off. It says, while some have argued that forcing women to serve in the army is misogyny, there seems to be little focus on how forcing men to serve is misandry, which it clearly is. The lives of women are protected, whilst the lives of men are threatened, and perhaps in many cases sacrificed. Should the combination of war and being male be enough to take choice away from men and force them to join the military? Some clearly think yes, but would a combination of a severely reducing birth rate and being female be enough to take a choice away from women and force them into pregnancy? I suspect those who say yes to the former would say no to the latter. That was really interesting to me, because there's a lot of talk nowadays about declining birth rates. And one thing I found quite sad and hard to articulate is when it comes to war, and how men are often the ones who are sent off to sacrifice themselves, particularly when, I think recently, like Ukraine and Russia a couple of years ago, that triggered a thought when I saw on social media how the women were leaving Ukraine and then forming relationships with other men from different countries. And then I was just like, what are the men kind of fighting for? If the people they're fighting for are leaving them? And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to articulate what I felt from that, but it's like under the surface, like a lot of men feel like, oh, society doesn't really value me and is happy to just throw me away. Can you speak on that to some degree?
I think so. It's quite a scary thing. I think I completely understand that war is a big, serious issue. Lives are threatened, risked, and action needs to be taken. I think there's loads around this, historically and recently. The one thing, there's lots of things, but one thing that I often hear is, well, men start the wars, men create the wars, so men can fight the wars. Again, that comes back to what you said about that collective guilt based on demographic, as if men are this rigidly homogenous group with no individual identity at all. And it's, you know, the guy who goes out to work however many hours a week to provide and protect for his family is not the same sort of man who is deciding that we need to have war. I mean, that if you can't distinguish the two, why? And as a man, I don't want to feel that I have to be responsible or take any action because of the actions of a small number of powerful men somewhere else. That's ridiculous. It's hateful as well. And again, it's just not helpful in any way. So there was also it was a couple of years ago, I think, when the whole thing was not long started in Ukraine and Russia. There were stories of men who were trying to figure out how they can safely, I think the word was, safely break their arm or leg to get out of, you know, being forced to fight in war. There's been videos online, you may have seen them, where men have been quite literally dragged off the streets and put into a van. Historically, look at what we saw historically. You know, there were men historically who were shamed to fight in war. You know, you even had the White Feather Brigade, you know, a group predominantly of women who were going around sticking white feathers on people, on men out of uniform, shaming them into fighting. Somebody I know, his great-granddad, I believe it was, he had a white feather stuck on him, and he didn't believe in war, he didn't believe in violence, but he had a white feather stuck on him, and that shamed him. He felt so into fighting, and he died in war. And so I think, you know, we see all of this a lot. And I think the other thing that I often hear is, well, it's misogyny, it's misogyny, it's misogyny. And through various discussions, what you find out is there's a narrative that would suggest, well, women are not allowed to fight in war. They're prevented from fighting in war. That choice was taken away from them. So men do it, so it's misogyny. But again, all we're doing there is focusing on what some people believe is the attitude that some may have about women and ignoring the attitude that some may have about men. So if you have powerful people in government, parliament and all of that saying, we are not going to make it possible for women to fight in war. Okay. There are issues and discussions to be had around that. And some could argue that clearly shows that they have a certain attitude about women. Okay. But that's not the whole story. What attitude is behind forcing and shaming just men into doing it? That has an attitude about men. But when you have these discussions with people, often they focus on the attitude that they think that shows about women. But what attitude does it show about men? It's not a one-way street. And whilst, you know, choice matters, in my opinion, whilst you are not forcing women to go and fight in war, they are not on the front line and they are protected. When you are forcing men to fight in war, the outcome is that they are not protected. They're neglected, they're threatened, they're sacrificed.
So is that misandry then?
Well, again, it would depend. I would say it is, because it depends. What is the attitude that's influencing that decision? So if you have a number of powerful people, men, women, people of the White Feather Brigade, men in government at the time, etc. Again, whether they're men or women, if the attitude that they hold is thinking, it's okay for us to sacrifice the lives of men because they are men, that is misandry. That shows a contemptible attitude towards men because they are men. Their lives matter to such a low degree that actually we can force them and shame them into doing this, whether they like it or not. And we don't care about them as individuals. We'll take choice away from them.
So I guess, so that's what it feels like then. And is that what then kind of leads into, hard to articulate, but is that what then can lead to misogyny then itself, in terms of you're telling men that they are effectively not worth that much to society? Does that also itself kind of go into like a feedback loop of just
I
hatred?
think we have to be careful how we get into that discussion, because it could lead, misogyny only exists because of misandry. Misandry only exists because of misogyny. And it's like, well, which came first and all of that? And how on earth would you ever even measure that? And how, I think what we have to say is both attitudes exist, and how on earth we'll ever prove if one caused the other. And it might be that one didn't cause the other, but both attitudes have existed for a very, very long time. We often talk about historically how misogyny existed, but we don't talk about how misandry existed. It has. It's been there for years, but we just ignore it. We often talk about how misandry can't exist because it's often powerful men making the decisions to control the lives of men that don't have that power. Well, just because they share the same gender doesn't mean it's not misandry. Absolutely, there are plenty of men and women who hold the attitude of misandry. Absolutely. So it's not just about, women towards men. It's about that attitude.
Can you talk about your book, please?
So the book came out in 2023 and it's called The Sexual Abuse of Boys and Men, Creating an Approach for Neglected Victims. It was a slog. I did not enjoy writing it. I enjoy talking more than I enjoy writing. But it was great to see that it was out there and people are using it and referring to it. One of the things that the book does is, unlike many other books that address the sexual abuse of boys and men, is, as I've said earlier, it utilises and values masculinity. So a lot of books that I've read and a lot of literature and research around male victims of sexual abuse, domestic abuse, whatever sorts of abuse, it kind of often implies and sometimes states outright that masculinity is a bit of a problem because actually boys and men want to be tough and strong, generally speaking. And if you've been abused, you don't feel tough and strong. And so then to engage in help and support, you've got to accept that you're vulnerable, and they won't do that. So we need to get rid of masculinity and help men embrace vulnerability. And I've kind of gone, well, you're kind of framing that in a really problematic, rigid way. The question I have is, why? Why is it so important that boys and men who have been abused, why is it important that they accept that they are and have been vulnerable? I'm not saying we should ignore that, but I'm certainly not saying we should focus in on it as intensely as we do. What about saying, as I said earlier, it takes strength and courage and resilience to face up to these things that are very, very difficult. And so actually, if you believe to some level that your idea of masculinity has been damaged, it can be useful to explore what the person's idea is. What about coming to therapy and building on that and going, actually, you're coming here now and that takes strength, so you start to kind of rebuild it up and explore their views. And that's one of the things that the book talks about, which a lot of books don't do. I don't demonize masculinity. I don't say it's bad, it's a problem, or it's toxic. It's about exploring those archetypal elements of masculinity and how they can be used to help therapy with abused boys and men more accessible, more attractive, more useful for them. So that is I would say makes my book a little bit different from other people's. It also talks about lots of other things as well, prevalence data, how we shouldn't really look or assume that what's reported to the police tells us everything that's happening. And it talks about how male victims of abuse are a lot less likely to disclose, especially to the police, especially if they were abused by a woman, and how that affects the data.
Okay. And where is it available?
Amazon, so Amazon, Waterstones, all the usual places. It's all on there, and
Wish we had more time overall, but I think that was a really good episode.
Okay.
I think a lot of content was shared that was quite insightful.
Okay.
Overall. So thank you so much, Phil.
Thanks for inviting me.